Pardon. Good morning. Uh, this perspective, we have a bunch of people here and then lots of people on the other side of the screen is always put me in a very awkward position because I know there are hundreds on the other side and there are about 60, supposed to be 60 here, mainly researchers of this institution. But in any case, we are happy to have the opportunity to organize this kind of event, which is the only positive heritage from the COVID, that fact that we started this hybrid meeting so we can put together people which is in probably in Rome or whenever. Anyhow, this is the second time we have the opportunity and the pleasure and the honor to host Jorge Blasquez. Jorge works for BP and the senior economist specialized in energy transition. The main body of his presentation is around the Statistical Review of World Energy, which is edition number 71, 72, 73, 70 something. And it's a very long-standing it's a very long-standing tradition for people working on energy. It's the BP Statistical Review has been a guidance for generation of economists. And this year, I say, is of course there is a, they say, of course, what is happening in Russia-Ukraine war is affecting also the report, or to some extent is also influencing the word, the way the report is written. But in any case, still have the numbers, the forecast, and of course the forecast, yes, do take into account what is happening. That we just every time we have the hope we have really the hope that will be soon, will be finished yesterday, and we shouldn't forget every time to remember that it's a shame that in Europe there is such a situation. After my presentation, which is basically almost finished, Jorge 45 minutes more or less for the presentation. That there is one discussion here, and then it's another friend and very close friend of the institution has been the first employee, correct? Yes, first employee in Fondazione in ages in which 1991, 1990. Okay, so long time ago. Yes, but we are still here, alive and kicking, talking about the usual stuff, energy. Now he made a career basically at Scuola Enrico Mattei School. Now it's the dean of the school, which is part of any corporate university, which provides a different path of formation. Master Medea, which is a master program on energy environmental economics. I think I did my part. Then after his presentation and answer discussion, we have probably say 10 minutes for Q&A. I will see, you can of course raise your hand, and for the rest of the people can send the email using the tool I will see the request here in this screen, very technological, and I will ask Jorge if you prefer to stay here.
No, I will go to the.
Okay.
To the.
The floor is yours, my friend.
Now? Okay. So thank you is the first thing I want to say. Normally, the energy outlook is a document which is designed to understand the uncertainties and risk associated to the energy transition. It is a document which is published and is public. I mean, you can download the document, which is this one with the graphics, the numbers, and it's a document which is used also to help to create the BP strategy. But in this occasion, I'm going to do something different. What I'm going to do is to compare how we thought or how we saw the energy system before the invasion of Ukraine and how the invasion and the war has changed the view of the energy system. So before starting with the presentation, I want to do some housekeeping. And the first thing I have to do is the energy outlook is based on scenarios. So the numbers that you are going to see here are not predictions, are not forecasts. This is something we make clear every time. I mean, probably you don't need it because all of you are researchers and people that understand energy and forecast. So this is based on scenarios, and from now on, tell you that I cannot predict the future, so I don't know what is going to happen next week. The other comment I want to say is that the scenarios I'm going to explain are based on existing technologies. So there is no technological disruptions, there is no nuclear fission, there is no new technologies that can change this. All the scenarios are based on technologies that we know are there, we know how to use, and we have a good view of what is the evolution of cost and maturity in business or commercial terms. Having said that, let me go to the three parts of the presentation, which is a rapid analysis of the scenarios that I'm going to use. So the energy outlook is based on three different scenarios that you can see here represented in three lines in terms of the emissions, carbon emissions. The green line is called new momentum. This is a scenario where technologies, social preferences, and policies evolve in a matter which is consistent with the recent past. So more or less it's a business as usual scenario. So this is how we expect emissions to evolve if the energy system stay in the current path. Emissions peaks in the 2020s, so during the next 10 years, and there is a decline in emission of 30% in year 2050. The other two scenarios are called accelerated and net zero, and you can see they are represented in an orange and blue line. These two scenarios are what-if scenarios, so what needs to change in the energy system to be consistent with Paris Agreement. In the accelerated, emissions decline by 2050 by around 75%, and this is more or less consistent with global warming of 2 degrees during this century. The other one, net zero, emissions decline by 95% in 2050, and this is more or less consistent with a global warming of 1.5% in this century. These two scenarios, those which are consistent with Paris, are scenarios where there is a clear push in favor of cleaner policies. There is also a rapid deployment of renewable technologies, but also there are some changes in social behavior to accelerate energy efficiency and to allow for the deployment of these new technologies. So this is more or less the three scenarios that I'm going to use. Just remember the green lines, new momentum represent a scenario which is more or less how the energy system is traveling right now. The other two are scenarios which are consistent with Paris Agreement. So rapid fall in emissions, rapid deployment of new technologies. Now, going directly to the key impact of the presentation. Before explaining BP scenarios and how we see the energy system changing, let me start with 3 slides containing charts produced by the IMF. So you can see here 2 different charts with 2 different lines. One represents the world economic outlook of October 2021, so before the war started, and the red line represents the same document, so the World Energy Outlook, but in October 2022, so once the war was there. As I said, this is something produced by the International Monetary Fund, and you can see here global. This is a mistake. It should be global growth, so it's global GDP, it's not prices. And in this scenario, what you can see is that there is a decline in the rate of growth globally and also in the European Union, but this is something that is a short-term impact. So in 2025, 2024, the impact of the war in terms of growth disappears. This is what the IMF is telling to us. This is the second element of the analysis, which is inflation. So you can see here again that there is a significant increase in inflation globally and in the European Union. So this is not new for us. But again, the key message of this slide is that globally and in the European Union, the IMF is saying this is going to be something which is going only to be, is going to have an impact in the short term. So in 2025, 2026, this is going to disappear. So short-term impact in growth, some short-term impact in inflation. The interesting part of the IMF analysis is this chart. Despite having a short-term impact on inflation and growth, there is a significant change in the level of oil prices, natural gas prices, and coal prices. And the question is exactly why? Why something which is a short-term, is having a short-term impact on the global economy seems to have a long-term impact on the energy system? And this is what I'm going to try to explain now. So going to the conclusion of the presentation, so you can disconnect if you think the rest of the presentation is boring. We have find 7 elements in which the energy system is going to change due to the war. The first one, it's we think the energy system, the war is going to have a long-term impact on the energy system. The second element is that the war is going to decline global GDP, not only in the short term, but also in the longer term. This is different what the IMF is saying, and it's going to have an impact also on the demand of energy. It's going to be lower. We think that from a policy perspective, the driving element, the key driving element, which has been climate change, is now having still a significant role, but there is a new actor, which is energy security. We think that governments are paying much more attention to energy security right now than 1-2 years ago. And this is going to have an impact on the type of energy that we are going to consume, and also the amount of carbon emissions that we are going to have as a result of these changes in energy security. Obviously, there's going to reduce, energy security is going to reduce the role of natural gas and oil, and I will explain that. So we see less oil and gas demand in the future. There's going to be less emissions as a result of the war. Also, there is also a very significant element that happened in 2022, which was the approval of the Inflation Reduction Act approved by the Biden administration. This is a package of $400 billion of expending in clean technologies, which is going to have an impact. There's going to be a decline in the expected production of supply and gas by Russia, and I will explain why in the next slide. And finally, and regarding natural gas, which is key for countries like Italy or Germany, or in a lesser extent Spain, the amount of LNG that Europe is going to need in the next 10 years is going to depend on if the plans that the European Union has in place right now. It's called Repower EU, the last implementation of the European Union. It's implemented, and there is a success in implementing these plans or not. And I will explain this in the next slides. So this is basically the presentation and the findings of the energy outlook. So this is why we think the energy system is going to be different now from what we expected 1 year ago. So what is the impact of the war in the energy system? We think there are 3 different elements which are impacting the energy system simultaneously, but the temporal space and the impact is not having place simultaneously. Is energy security, so more importance for energy security, weaker economic growth, I will explain what, and a change in the way energy is supplied. So energy security. Russia has used gas as a weapon in the last year, so has weaponized energy supply. And this has consequences for the energy system and for the way policymakers are approaching to their policies. So in particular, we think that energy security is playing a higher role in the policy making. So if in the 5 years climate policies has been the key for explaining energy changes, energy policy is going to be there, but energy security is now also at the center of the policy. And also affordability. I mean, you probably may remember European governments trying to take in measures to reduce the cost of natural gas and the impact in households. So at the very end, Russian war is putting the energy trilemma, security, sustainability, affordability, at the center of the policies. The second element, it's economic growth. In the short term, clearly there is less economic growth. We have this increase in the cost of energy. There is a sharp increase also in the cost of food. Central banks are increasing interest rate to try to control inflation, and they are decelerating economic growth. So there is clearly a short-term impact, negative short-term impact of the war. But there is more, in our opinion. We think that the war is also accelerating deglobalization, or globalization, if you want, is growing slower. There is more political and geopolitical polarization. We see in the future less international trade, less economic integration that we saw a year ago. And for this reason, we think that economic growth is going to be slower than it was before. It's not much, it's only 0.2% per year on aggregate terms. So GDP growth was 2.6 in the previous energy outlook in 2022. Now it's 2.4. So you can say, well, 2.2 is not much, but when you have this growth compound over a period of 30 years, there is a significant reduction on the level of GDP in 2050. So short-term negative impact, but also short-term negative impact due to this increased polarization, or if you want, less economic integration in the future. The last element of the puzzle is its energy supply. As I said before, Russia is not longer a reliable or credible supplier of energy. Western countries are imposing sanctions on imports of oil and oil products from Russia. And as a result of these two elements, sanctions, also the lack of credibility by Russia and Western companies and Western countries finding alternative suppliers, we see that Russian production of oil and gas is going to be smaller than we thought in the past. I want to let you know that Russia is probably the most significant country in terms of energy export. So it's the first exporter of natural gas and oil combined. So probably from the perspective of energy integrated is the most significant country in that terms. So these are the three elements that we are combining in the presentation, which are significant importance of energy security, lower GDP growth, and changing the way the world uses and consumes energy sources. And I'm going to explain one by one the 7 points that I explained before. Here you can see the change in the forecast of GDP between 1 year and the other. So how we have changed our view in terms of GDP. And you can see a significant decline in global GDP. So GDP is 2% lower in 2025, and in 2050 is around 6% lower. The purple line represents global growth, the dark green represents developed economies, the light green represents emerging economies. Something which is clear from this chart is that the impact of lower GDP is not symmetric among countries. Countries that trade more and more depending on trade and international integration, like economies from Asia, are going to be worse off due to the war in the long term. So it's China, but also Africa, for example, countries that are suffering more from this situation. In particular, for example, GDP in China is 7% lower than it was before. Africa is 12% lower. It was the economy that has to grow more, and it's also the country or region which is going to be more impacted by the new economic situation. Other countries, like for example, United States, has no impact at all from the world. So it's pretty much isolated from the new situation. So there is an asymmetry in this chart. But this is basically the key message. Global GDP is going to be around 6% lower in 2050 with asymmetric situations. Global GDP implies less economic activity and implies less demand of energy. And this is what you can see in this chart. So in 2025, global demand of energy is around 4% lower. In 2050, it's around 6% lower, pretty much aligned with GDP. The interesting thing is that we can differentiate what part is due to lower GDP itself, so what is the impact due to lower activity, but there is a part that has to do with efficiency gains. And this is something, it's associated with the change in policies in favor of more energy security. And I will explain this a little later, but the way we have introduced energy security in our models, in the way we see the economy, is that countries are trying to disincentivize the consumption of energy which is imported. Mostly it's going to be oil and natural gas, which is the two energies which are more heavily traded. And the way to do this is, it's explained in the document, it's by putting an extra cost when you have to import some type of energy. It's the way to disincentivize the consumption. Obviously, more energy, most expensive energy implies you try to save energy consumption. And this is what we can see here. So it's not only that we are consuming less because we have lower GDP, it's also governments and policies try to save energy because they want to import less energy. So, and this is what this chart is saying. So part of the decline is due to lower GDP, part of the decline in energy is due to higher efficiency. This is the second chart, how energy security is changing the energy mix. So I think this is probably the most significant chart of the presentation. If you look carefully, you can see that in 2035, energy demand is around 2% lower, which is the first purple line that you have in the chart. Green and orange represent the decline in oil and natural gas, and it's a decline of around 6%. So energy demand for oil and gas is declining around 6%. And the reason for that, it's energy security. So countries which are importing oil and gas say, well, we want to replace or consume less or replace as possible these two energy sources. It's not the case of coal. Coal is declining around 2%, and the reason for that is that India and China, that consumes around 70–75% of total coal consumption, they have vast reserves of these two energies. So there is a decline in total coal consumption because there is a decline in Chinese and Indian GDP that is pretty much aligned with the decline in energy. So in some sense, the losers of the energy security are oil and gas. Two other energies are increasing, which are nuclear and renewables. Both of them are produced domestically. So if you want to replace natural gas and oil and you don't have coal, you need to produce them. You have to replace them by, well, nuclear is one alternative, and more important, renewables. So as a result of this, the energy mix is getting decarbonized faster than it was before. So you can see here the amount of energy carbon intensity, so the amount of emissions embodied in 1 unit of energy. And what you can see is that we see energy embodied or energy intensity declining by 2%. This is the natural result of the transition from hydrocarbons to renewables. And this is the scenario that we are using to do this analysis is new momentum, and I will explain why we're using new momentum and not accelerated or net zero, which are decarbonized scenarios. I will explain that one. But this is the key takeaway of this slide. So energy security implies more renewables, more nuclear because they are domestically produced, and they imply more decarbonized energy mix. Let's move to export and imports of oil and gas. This is, I think it's a complex chart. So you can see here the amount of oil and gas which is imported over total primary energy consumed in the European Union, China, and India. These three regions, or these three countries, represent around 50% of total imports of oil and around 45%, 50% also of total imports of natural gas. So this is half of the markets for these two commodities. In the three cases, there is a decline of imported energy. So energy is declining because we are using, because GDP is smaller, but also is declining because we, in relative terms, consume less or import less oil and gas. European Union, for example, is importing around 95% of oil and around 90 or 85% of natural gas. India and China are importing around 75–85% of total oil that they consume and around 55% of the total gas that they consume. And the key message of this slide is that the loser of the new scenarios, the loser of the war, are international trade of oil and natural gas. So it's basically these two sources. It's the same message of the previous slide, but from the point of view of the countries that are importing energy. I said before that I was using new momentum, and I want to explain why and not net zero. So this is a chart that is showing the decline in total emissions in new momentum, which is the scenario where the energy system evolves in a matter which is consistent with the current policies and current energy system, and net zero, which is the most ambitious scenario which is consistent with Paris Agreement. So it's a scenario where practically you reach zero emissions by 2050. You can see here that the first column represents the decline is broken into two, what Paris explained by GDP, wartime is explained by lower carbon intensity in 2030, 2040, and 2050. The first bar is new momentum, and you can see that between 2040 and 2050, emissions in new momentum decline by, on average, 2.5 gigatons of CO2. Is this a lot? Well, in 2020, so the year of COVID, with the lockdowns and the pandemic, the reduction in emissions was 2.2 gigatons in carbon emissions. So it's a significant reduction in emissions. It's not something which is marginal, it's quite chunky. So this is the same impact as having a COVID pandemic every year from 2025 to 2050. So significant. The second bar of the three parts represents a decline in net zero, which is around 1 gigaton in 2030, and it's less than 0.5 in 2050, which is very small. And the question is why? Why is very small? And the answer, I mean, it's straightforward when you think this. It's once you have decarbonized the energy system, it doesn't matter what is the change in your energy demand. You are not emitting CO2 any longer. Which is less clear from this chart is the implication in terms of energy, in terms of policy. This is saying also that if you are decarbonizing the energy system and you are getting more aggressive trying to enhance your energy security or reduce the amount of oil and gas or coal that you are importing. Europe, for example, is importing coal from Russia. You are also making your energy system more reliable or less, more resilient, if you want, to in terms of energy security. So decarbonization and energy security goes hand in hand. So this is why, for example, I think in China it's achieving record after record in terms of deployment of renewables. It has to do with climate change, yes, but also it has to do with energy security. So if you want to increase your energy security and you don't have oil and gas, the best way to do this is by decarbonizing the energy mix. I think this is the other lesson from this chart. This is the reduction of emission in new momentum in the two in the energy outlook 2022 and 2023. This is a 2.5 decline in emissions on average, which doesn't look much in this chart, but it's a significant decline. So I am approaching to the end of the comments. This is a chart that reflects production of Russian oil in new momentum. So what is the change? Russia is producing today, well, it was producing before the war around 2 million barrels per day. So it was with United States, the largest oil producer in the world. It's not Saudi Arabia. It's producing around 10 million. And we expect, or we think that in the different scenarios, this is going to be something around 7 and 9 million barrels, 12, 1, 2, before pandemic. So it's producing around 1 million less currently. And what you see in the following, in the different bars is the change in what we were expecting before and what we are expecting now. So there is a loss in Russian production of around 1.5. So the question is, okay, this is due because of the sanctions. It's going to lack of credibility as a reliable exporter, lack of some key technologies to produce oil that are impacted by sanctions. So there is going to be a 1.5 less million barrels per day produced than we were expecting today. So, and the question is, who is going to replace Russia? And the question is not so straightforward because there is also a decline in the amount of oil demanded. In the long term, it's more or less the decline in demand is more or less corresponding to the decline in Russia and other developed economies. In the short term, sorry, OPEC economies, in the short term, is going to be replaced by more oil produced by United States. And remember what I said at the beginning, there is no significant impact in the long term on American GDP, and in the short term, there is more oil demand from United States, in particular shale oil demand. So there is a change in emissions. There is also a change in the way we are consuming energy. So there is less oil demand, and we are also replacing oil demand by renewables and nuclear through electrification of different sources. What about natural gas? Well, I found this chart very interesting. This is the reduction in natural gas demand in 2030. So you can see here 3 colors in the first part. The purple one represents pipeline trade, and it's around 150 BCMs. 150 BCMs is the amount of natural gas that was imported by the European Union from Russia using pipelines. So this trade, this demand has already disappeared. So there is no longer, there is no Russian gas coming from, or significant Russian gas coming from pipelines, excluding some coming south via trucking from Russia. But we are saying here is that pipeline gas traded by pipelines, particularly from Russia to Europe, is going to disappear in 2030. There is also going to be a reduction of natural gas domestically produced. Remember that, have in mind that there is a decline in GDP and there is a decline in total energy demand consumed. And there is also a small decline in LNG, so liquefied natural gas, which is traded. And the second bar, it's the decomposition of that. The decline, that decline, which is the dot, which is in the middle, that dot there is the level, is the result of 2 different effects. Less natural gas exported by Russia and more natural gas exported from other countries, in particularly, again, the US. So I think it's an interesting puzzle, all this. So And this is how we see the change in oil and gas in the global system. And I want to finish the presentation regarding the impacts that we explore in this document that I said is free, so you can have all the charts and read the comments there. It's how we think natural gas consumption is going to change in the European Union. So this is pretty I think it's sophisticated in a sense. So the first chart represents total natural gas demand consumed in 2019 and a breakdown by different sources. So you can see here again the dark purple, which is in the middle, which is around 150 m, which is Russian gas coming through pipelines to the European Union. And there you have LNG imports, you have pipelines coming from Algeria or Norway, which is the light purple, and there is also from domestic oil production in Europe, from Romania, and Germany is producing a little bit. So there is a small production in the European Union in different parts. The first part of the three different subcharts represent what we were expecting a year ago. And the second part, for example, I don't want to commit a mistake. So that's what we was expecting before in new momentum in 2050. The following is the new scenario accelerated. The following is net zero. So if you look, for example, in new momentum, which is the first one, you can see that the largest difference between this bar and this bar is the purple, which has totally gone. In the three scenarios, there is a significant reduction, almost disappear, of Russian gas coming through pipelines. And the question is, how are we replacing this? And this is a combination of two different things. One is energy savings. So we are using less natural gas. So there is a decline in the size of the bar in the three cases. And the other part, which is significant, is imported LNG. And I said before, at the beginning of the presentation, that the amount of LNG, not liquefied natural gas, that Europe is going to need depends very much on the success of their policies. You probably are aware of something called Fit for 55, which was the program announced by the European Union to achieve net zero emissions in 2050. It was an intermediate pass saying that we have to reduce energy emissions 55% in 2030. This was replaced by a new program once the war started, which was named Repower EU, which was like Fit for 55, but in steroids. So it was more aggressive. In particularly, was much more ambitious in terms of the reduction of natural gas, which was replaced by biomethane and also was replaced by hydrogen. Well, net zero is pretty much aligned with Repower EU in terms of natural gas. So what this is saying is that the European Union succeeds and is able to achieve the plans that already has in place. There is no really need for a significant increase in LNG with what we had before. If not, and we are in new momentum, so business as usual or in accelerated, which is less ambition, there is a significant increase in the amount of natural gas coming from ship to Europe. And this is all I wanted to say about war in Ukraine. But I want to extract some lessons about the recent shortage of energy that we have seen. I mean, for economists and probably for energy experts, this is not going to be a surprise. But the first lesson is that when you have a disruption, even in a small amount of supply, there is a significant impact on price volatility and economic and economic growth, and there is also a significant impact on social cost. This is also is things that we already knew from the oil crisis of the 70s, but this is something I think we have to remember from time to time, that if there is a shortage, even if it is small, in oil and gas, traded oil and gas, or any other type of energy, you see a significant impact on cost, on prices if you want, and it has an impact on GDP. This is due to a very inelastic demand and supply. This is the first lesson. The second lesson, and this is something has been coming around, is that we need to move quickly and decisively from fossil fuels to a decarbonized energy mix. This has been explained during the presentation. I mean, if you decarbonize the energy mix, you have a system which is more secure. You have energy which is produced more locally. So energy transition, so climate change and energy security, in this case, are aligned. And the third lesson, which is something that I think that the two previous lessons are well known. The last one, I think, is something policymakers tend to ignore most of the cases, at least in my opinion, is that the transition has to be orderly. If you reduce the amount of energy, if you try to reduce the amount of supply, and particularly of oil and gas, you try to reduce the amount of energy which is supplied, but you don't have the same type of policy on demand side, you are creating an imbalance. So to have a transition which is orderly, you need to act simultaneously on demand and supply. It's not enough to act on supply. This is some papers that academic papers that explore this point. I mean, it's I think which is an important lesson. And I don't know if I have much time, but I think I'm going to finish here. Alessandro, to have time for comments and discussion later. So I'm not going to explain the rest of the presentation. I think it has been enough.
While Enzo is preparing for his presentation, just two communication. The first one, the people outside this room can send questions using the chat box, right? So we will see question. And the second is just from my side, that in all this politically correctness, there is no pity for colorblind people like me, that with all these colors, I'm getting crazy. We need to find a solution. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alessandro, for the invitation. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you, Georgi, for your presentation. We always learn a lot by the BP scenarios. I try to develop some reflections on these scenarios, maybe in some moment widening the perspective, and another moment making it shorter. Let's start with the war. What is the impact? So when the war started, so the first intuition was that that would have spread renewables because you have less fossils, and so there is an empty room for renewables. And I remember I wrote an article on this. Well, it is difficult to say if this is really something that will occur. I think that this war is a test for the energy transition, and it is a test along three dimensions. So the first dimension is the decarbonization. So the main argument of environmentalists when they say that renewable don't expand is that they don't expand because they can't expand. So there is an incumbent there, which is fossils. And now you have 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas that evaporates. So there is a huge highway for renewables. So if we look at the data, so the first data, of course, it's just 1 year, it's 22. So the data are lights and shadows. So this comes from the Amber report, and this is what happens in the electricity sector. So for the first time, actually, solar and wind were the main source in the electricity generation, but we had also an expansion of coal and of gas. So to some extent, this was due to some specificity, the standby of nuclear, and what happened to hydro, which is because of the drought. However, we don't have clear indication that there is an increase in renewables. If we look at the capacity, yes, here, as far as solar PV is concerned, we can see that there is a very good expansion of capacity, so plus 47% versus the previous year, which is plus 25% of total capacity, which is quite a lot. But you don't find a similar perspective for wind. When we look at wind, you can see here, so they are more stable, so the increase is quite a little. So going back to this dimension, I think that we have lights and shadows, so it's not clear if there is this spreading of low carbon sources. So as a result, you have that carbon dioxide increased by 3.9% in the electricity sector. That is something that we did not expect. Another dimension for testing the energy transition, I think, is carbon pricing. So in a net zero world, we will have higher carbon prices, energy prices due to carbon prices. And what is this war? It's nothing but that an implementation of carbon price, because we had a spike in the natural gas prices. This is a unique spike. If you look at the history of the oil market, 150 years, you don't find such a big increase in such a short time. So we can reflect on what happened to the prices, and we have to reflect about the capacity of the system to bear these higher prices. So in a net zero world, we will have a carbon tax. So this is what the institutions, well-known institutions, says. According to IMF, $75. According to the International Energy Agency, $130 in 2030s. So we had an increase in price. So 100 carbon tax of 100 euro means, if you translate it in an increase in prices, increasing the gasoline price of 20 cents per liter, and then the natural gas price of 20 euro per megawatt hour, which is this 20 euros is more or less the increase that we have now, because the price was around 15, 20, now is around 40. So what was the reaction of the government? So the government reacted by helping and subsidizing consumers. So these are the last data. They are astonishing. So they are data from the think tank Bruegel. So 758 billion euros were put on the table, which is a huge amount of money, which is more or less what Obama put on the table in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So that is the dimension. That means that, having high prices and bearing high prices is not so easy. And energy transition implies this. This is the world where we should go. Finally, there is energy savings. So high prices, that implies changes in behavior. Here, of course, we do not have enough data. So there are the first estimates by the International Energy Agency. They say that the gas demand in Europe decreased by 85 billion cubic meters, and the contribution of behavior of energy saving was about 8%. That is, we save the energy because energy is more expensive. And this 8%, I think, is a good number. That is, it says that things are working, that effectively, when you have an increase in the prices, you have some change in the behavior. But globally, I think we can't still say that there is this fastening of the energy transition due to the war. We will see next year. So next year we will see what happens, and it will be a test if there will be that big expansion in renewables that is thought by several institutions. Cutting emissions. So BP is correctly very cautious. So they stress that they are not forecasts, they are scenarios, and that is the right way to do. That is, there are tools for reflecting on what can be in the future. But I say something, and what I say is that there will be a decrease in emissions. So even if the speed can be in a way, or can be strong or less strong, but there will be that decrease. I deeply hope that they are right, because so when we deal with scenarios, so we tend to introduce this peak in carbon, and if we go to the past, we can find many scenarios in which there was a peak. The peak was in 2012, 14, 16, 18, 20, and it does not come, and it is not coming. And so here a reflection on the strength of the climate policy, I think, should be done. And I will say something at the end of my presentation. Let's see the numbers. So these are numbers by the UNFCCC that started to publish the report when there are the COPs. So according to the UNFCCC, in order to go to net zero in 2050, so greenhouse gases should go down by 45% in 2030 versus 2010. And you can see here the last number, Sharm el-Sheikh 10.6 plus 10.6. So they are increasing. And if we introduce the long-term net zero target, we go to minus 4.2%. We can put this number, try to put this number inside the BP scenario, so 2010, 2030. So basically this is the minus 45, and you can see that the net zero is more moderate, is less aggressive than what is stated in that UNFCCC report. And this is the minus 5%, which is basically the accelerated and finally the current pledges of the Paris Paris Agreement, what follows Sharm el-Sheikh's, are just on the new momentum scenarios. We had some weeks ago the last data about carbon dioxide in 2022, and they still increased. So they still increased. So if we start from Paris 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2. So these are 7 years in which emissions increased in 5 cases. In one case, decreases because of COVID, minus 6%. And then there was a moderate decrease one of this year. So decreasing emissions is very tough. So this is what the history says. So this is a graphic from the International Energy Agency. So what we see, if we take a long run into consideration, a long run perspective, is that emissions increases. When they do not increase is because there is some drama. There is the war, there is the oil shock, the financial crisis, or there is COVID, which is the biggest decrease we had. This is showed very, very well also by BP with this high identity analysis. You can see here the emissions in the last 15 years decreased in 2009 because of the fall in the economic activity, and in 2020 because of COVID. And you can see that here energy intensity, yellow, is playing a more important role than carbon intensity. So we have more efficiency than real decarbonization. These are the 2 years in which we have the reduction in emissions. So according to the BP scenarios, energy intensity should decrease so between 2.1 up to 3.5 in the net zero. So here you can see the rates in the last 50 years, and so they in the last 10 years, 15 years, so they are around 1.5 to 2% at best. So it will be difficult to move to 3% or 3.5. Maybe the situation is better for renewables, and you can see here the increase of the spreading of renewables in the different years, and this is generations. It is around 15%, and on average the rates are what you read here: 4, 5, 5.6% in the net zero, according to the BP scenarios. Of course, as we move forward, the bulk of renewables will expand, and so the denominator of the ratio will become larger, and so it will be, I mean, the increase, the growth rate will become smaller, of course. Another reflection could be done about demography. So this is the trend in per capita carbon dioxide, which is not a decreasing trend, And we know that there is an increasing trend. It is the trend in demography, and that you can see a big expansion in Asia, and an even bigger expansion in Africa. And these are areas in which the per capita emissions are quite low, especially in Africa. So we can expect here that there will be an increase in emissions, and so putting this together with net zero will not be easy at all. Last reflection on the policies. Just one slide. So basically, policymakers, our generations, so is trying to do something that was never done. This is a revolution. That is thinking of changing an entire economic structure and entire energy structure by the top. So it is the policy made. This was something that was never done. So you have some experiments in planet economies, but it is a different kind of experiments. We know that they did not work so well. So doing this in a few years will not be easy. And when we see the numbers, so we find something strange. So let's take into consideration, for instance, a simple indicator like the carbon intensity of income is the content of carbon within income, within the GDP. And you can see this decreasing trend, which is a very good phenomenon. And to some extent, climate policies should be reflected in this indicator. So we should see that the strength of the climate policy is here. So when we go to see the numbers, at least I remain a bit surprised. So I show you the carbon intensity of income for China, the US, and European Union. And these are the numbers. So here you have in the first histogram, so that is the period 1990, 2020, and you can see that China decarbonized more than the US and Europe. So to some extent, this is understandable because China is, changing the economy, is moving towards services, and okay. It is not so understandable, fully understandable, why the decarbonization in the US is faster than in Europe. So because Europe is the leader in climate policy, and it is strange that that this happens in the recent years, even in the last 5 years, 15, 20, which is a period in which in the US there was as President Donald Trump. So that is real strange. So I think that Zoom should be made in this topic of the real strength of the climate policies, what the climate policies could really do. So why we don't see in a simple indicator like the carbon intensity of income this strength that that is in the documents now, that is in the planning of the European Union, and why we don't see this. So the future is very, very unknown. There is a lot of uncertainty, and I think that this statement that is always stressed by Georg. So these are scenarios, they are not predictions, they are not forecasts. Is a real truth. This is a way for us for doing a reflection. So saying what is probable and what is not probable is very, very difficult. I would like to end with a sentence by my beloved Bernard Russell that says that we don't know what is probability. Basically, probability is the most important concept in modern science, especially as nobody has the slightest notion of what it means. And to some extent, we are in this situation. So with these words, I leave you. Thank you.
Something that
No, yes.
to add one, I have a question from outside. Let's see, I have a question here. The question here is, in case
The microphone.
and in case of developing countries endowed with large oil and gas reserves, fossil fuel exporters, what kind of policies can contribute to accelerating clean energy transition? $100 million question.
Yeah, there is. I think the debate about decarbonization it's moving from technologies, which I think it was the core of in the past, towards financing. And financing in emerging economies, it's clearly key. I mean, the world cannot decarbonize only by decarbonizing rich countries. To be successful in decarbonization of the world and climate change, we have to decarbonize all at the same time. In a sense, all the scenarios that I have presented here, at least the two which are consistent with Paris, are scenarios in which there is a global common trends in policies to achieve 75% decrease, to achieve 95% decrease. But absolutely, I mean, financing and putting economic resources in hands of developed economies it's key to have a success in decarbonization. What happened with countries which are rich in it's also a debate. I mean, it's they can say you have used and developed your oil and gas reserves. Now it's our turn. What can I say to that?
One. There is a question from Andrea, and then I will add a consideration. No, my consideration is that no one is the hypothesis that there would be a coup d'etat Russia and because at the end of the day, you know, natural gas from Gazprom to using the pipeline and bringing natural gas from Russia to Italy, just to give you some, is probably the cheapest option in terms of cost still. So, but this scenario, of course, I'm not asking a comment from you because you are in a position to give such a comment. But you know, this kind of scenario in general is we are considering either this war is going forever, which is impossible by definition, or people is not working about a possible consideration about the future. The end, and of course, should end at a certain point in 10 years, 15 years, I don't know. No one is preparing a scenario in which there will be a different situation, let's put it this way, as if this problem will be still forever. Please.
So first of all, thank you. I have a complimentary comment and a devil's advocate question. So a complimentary comment is that I'm using your BP scenarios for my students every year. So I ask permission to continue to use it even now, okay? Now, to say how good is your presentation. There is an interesting point in one of the slides in which you were showing that the increase in China and India was actually going up before going down, shares and because we economists think that the prices are made at the margin, not at the average. This could mean that there is an increase in the demand of energy that can keep up the prices and could explain why, that's the question, why you have a difference, a permanent difference in the energy prices and not on the GDP in the global scenario, because you can have this extra demand. But the more general question is about the two sides of the coins that implicitly you have presented. You said governments should, even Enzo said this one, government should, you know, accompany demand with appropriate policies in order to keep the balance. However, we know that on the other side, that's the devil's advocate question, there are people like the Saudis who say, we are those who are in charge of keeping the supply and the demand on balance with our quota system. They think they, you know, honestly, they do a good favor on the world by keeping prices stable, by controlling with OPEC plus, that's the devil's advocate, of course, no question, you know, controlling the supply in an appropriate way in order to keep the, you know, the balance with the demand. So, final question is, what's your opinion? Who is right? Our governments to put carbon tax or the oligopoly of the OPEC plus? That's a provocative question at the end.
Cannot expect an answer. No, it's just a joke.
No, I mean, it's there is no right or wrong answer to this. I mean, the OPEP has some. There was a discussion in 2020 during the pandemic when prices collapsed. Remember the price of West Texas was negative at some point, which you were paying to sell oil. And there was a debate about the importance of role of OPEC. I mean, I remember reading articles saying OPEC is already dead. Because in a world where demand is declining, you have no alternative but to reduce demand to keep prices stable. There is no other alternative. It was totally reversed a few months ago when there was the war in Ukraine and Russia, and people started to say, I mean, OPEC must intervene and produce more, and they have to pump more oil, and you oil companies have to invest more in oil, etc., etc. So I think we have not be confused by the short term and the longer term. I mean, in the longer term, you need to know what you want, and if we want to decarbonize, all these are scenarios. The economy, you have to make sure that if you are pushing for less oil and gas supply, you are putting the demand in the same condition. But this is saying nothing.
Question from Anna. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. So I was wondering, as you have shown that we're going to move away from the fossil fuels over the next couple of years, why BP is investing more than double of what it is investing in renewables and fossil fuels in 2023. And then I was also wondering, given that BP has made record profits last year as a result of the Russian invasion, why the company is not using that event as like a paradigm shift towards renewables, why you're spending millions on social media campaigns, why these kinds of reports are being made if they don't seem honest at all.
Thank you for the honest comment. It's well, it's I mean these scenarios are used to help to define a strategy. So as I said, they are not forecast. There is one scenario which is not consistent with Paris, but we are saying, for example, that in all the scenarios, a common trend that we see is a decline in the demand of fossil fuels. So you may say, okay, then if there is a demand in fossil fuels, why there is no the corresponding decline in BP production, you would say. And what I can say to that is that I am not an expert on BP strategy, that's for sure. But the target, for example, right now is to decline the production of hydrocarbons by 25% in 2030.
Why not now?
But you have to do it gradually. You cannot cut. And again,
yeah, but you're doing the opposite. You're investing in fossil fuels.
But we are investing more in renewables. Yeah, I mean, this is part of another debate. Is even in the most, I mean, how much investment is needed in the world in oil and gas to achieve net zero emissions? This can be the question. And even in the most ambitious scenarios of the IPPC, which are not produced by BP or Shell or any other companies, still significant amounts of oil and gas investment is needed. And this is what I said before, you need an orderly scenario. So, I mean, read media, and people has been asking why oil companies that do not invest more in oil and gas to help to reduce prices. It was produced by Italian newspapers, I'm sure. Same thing, Spanish or British. And the question is simple. I mean, if you want to be in a path which is consistent with Paris, zero emissions, still you need to invest in oil and gas. You cannot cut, simply you cannot cut production now, unless you want to have prices of oil and gas multiplying by 10. By the way, in the web page there is a nice chart about the investment which is needed in oil and gas in the 3 different scenarios. Obviously, as you decarbonize, the amount needed is smaller, but still it's hundreds of billions what you need globally. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice presentations. I just had a question regarding the last presentation. You said, Professor, that there is a sort of process going on, that it's the very first time that the human beings actually try to change a complete paradigm from the top towards the bottom, because in the past it was the opposite way. I'm thinking, because I'm thinking from for example, from the point of view of the electricity system right now, and I think, and that's a question on your side, on your opinion, that from the electricity point of view, from the electricity side, from the electricity market, there is already a sort of tipping point that we have already passed in terms of policy that are needed to reach some goals. And now the big role is played by the market. So it's already something that is going from the bottom to the top. I mean, the market is already playing the biggest role. I'm thinking about, for example, costs. The levelized cost of electricity of a solar panel is already quite small compared to, for example, a CCGT power plant. And so my question is, do you think that it will come a sort of point, a sort of tipping point of this process starting from the top and going towards the bottom, where it will be reversed? So it will be the bottom that can create this process and can actually change something, I think, more effectively, because it will change it more effectively rather than starting from the top. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Well, I think it will come. There will be a moment in which the process will be driven by the bottom, and at the end of the day, the transition will be as the previous transition, that were transition done by technology and by the market. But the point is when. Nobody knows when. And there is an issue of velocity, because the problem with this transition is that it must be done soon, because in this race there is another runner which is not so much enlightened, which is the melting ice, and there something is occurring. So this transition must be done soon. So electricity is a good example. So of course, so the price, the costs of solar PV so collapsed. I remember I wrote an article in 2010, and I presented it in a conference of the International Association for Energy Economics about forecasts and scenarios of the costs of solar and wind. And that article was entirely wrong, because the cost dropped so deeply and fastly that nobody imagined that. But there remain some problems because it's not only an issue of cost, there is an issue of storage, there is an issue of network. And there is a third issue, which is, I think, is the most important, that electricity is just 1/5, 1/4 of the total demand. So there is an issue of penetration of the electricity, and electricity is not penetrating. So that is, if you see the share of electricity in the TFC, total final consumption, you don't see penetration of electricity. So you see penetration, for instance, in China or India, because they are developing countries. But in countries like OECD countries, you don't see a fast pace. But that is the issue, because a net zero world is a world in which electricity penetrates.
With the simple consideration, don't read old paper, never ever. Because if you read your old stuff, you feel, terrible. Okay, I need to thank you, Jorge, as usual, perfect, and Enzo for your presentation. And so I need to say thank you to all, to people which is connected, and I see you next time, I hope soon. Thank you very much.